Welcome to Was Justice Served, the podcast where we journey back in time to some of the past's most cryptic criminal cases, brought to you by Findmypast. In each episode, our experts take a look at the evidence found in our historical newspapers and records and try to unpick what really happened. We'll be looking at the gory, the heartbreaking, and the shocking cases that gripped the nation. Join us as we uncover some of history's most scandalous crimes, follow the twists and turns of the trial, and ask the ultimate question, was justice served? But don't just take our word for it. Analyze the evidence for yourself. For each episode, you can access the case files, a complete collection of the historical newspapers we've talked about, all online at findmypast.co.uk/was justice served. Before we get started, this is just a note to say that this is a crime podcast, so it will contain graphic descriptions and scenes that some listeners may find upsetting. We know that crimes have ripple effects down the centuries and still affect the families of those involved to this day. I want to acknowledge this and explain that our purpose is to reframe the past and give a voice to these people lost to time. Welcome to the first episode in our series. My name is Jen Baldwin, professional genealogist and research specialist at Findmypast.
And my name is David Olusoga. I'm Emeritus Professor of Criminology at Birmingham City University, an author and TV presenter. But today I'm not going to reveal that I actually have a PhD in history for obvious reasons.
For this pilot episode, I'm delighted to welcome historian, writer, broadcaster, presenter, filmmaker, and professor of public history at the University of Manchester, David Olusoga OBE. Welcome, David, and thank you so much for being a part of our introductory episode to Was Justice Served?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be your pilot episode.
We're so excited to present this story today because you have actually brought us this story. This comes straight from your family history, so it makes for a very special episode to start our journey with. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came across this before we dive in?
Well, we've known about some details of this history my whole life. But a few years ago, my Aunt Verna, began to do some family research. And then I was researching other aspects of my family for a TV program I was producing. And inevitably, the researchers and the genealogists who we hired to help me with that were very drawn to this story because it is the great tragedy in the story of my ancestors.
And so it's a story in your family that has brought you shame, or a story in your family that's got no editorial to it at all?
Well, I don't believe in pride or shame in association with ancestors. I think they're juvenile emotions to go into history with. So I don't feel shame about my ancestors. And if they did wonderful things, I wouldn't feel pride about them. But I do think, just as a normal human being, you can look at people from the past, and perhaps especially if you're related to them, and just feel the tragedy of what they went through and the challenges of their times. But this is a story that has shaped the culture within my family. It's shaped the lives of people in my family for generations. I do believe history should be emotional. It should be about not just what we know about people, but empathy, trying to understand what it was like for them, to try to, in some ways, put yourself in their shoes.
Fantastic. Let's then move into the details of the crime.
Shortly before 1 p.m. on the 10th of September 1896, David Crichton packs up his tools and decides to take a break from painting a shopfront on Shields Road in Byker, an industrial working-class town just outside of Newcastle. He meanders down the street with his colleagues Daniel Gray and William Forrest for about a quarter of a mile, stopping to chat at the corner of Dalton Street outside the Butcher's Arms pub and near to a draper's shop. A man walking towards them suddenly catches his attention. He's not a stranger, but in fact a man he knows as George Ewart. George stops at a nearby letterbox, and David watches as he appears to post something. His colleague Daniel Gray has also noticed George. The atmosphere becomes tense. Daniel turns to David, growling under his breath in irritation about George's presence. As the pair continue to chat, David sees from the corner of his eye that George is now walking directly towards them. Too late, he spots a revolver in George's raised right hand, pointing straight at Daniel's ribs, and, just 2 feet away from him, he fires it. Clutching his side and screaming, "Murder! Murder!" Daniel sprints away around the corner, with George in pursuit. As if waking up from a trance, David and William turn on their heels and run in the opposite direction. Catching their breath, hiding in the next street, they hear 2 more shots fired. Meanwhile, in the draper's shop around the corner, Assistant William Kirk hears the crack of a revolver shot and sees 2 men running towards him. Before he can react, the door is wrenched open. Daniel enters, bleeding profusely from a wound in his side. From outside the shop window, George fires a second shot, which shatters the glass and barely misses the shop assistant. He fires a third, then lowers the revolver, turns and walks back down the street, the gun still smoking in his hand. Back on the corner, confectioner George Waite is enjoying his lunch in the butcher's arms when he hears the 3 shots. He makes his way out of the pub to see what all the commotion is about. In the middle of the street, he finds George looking dazed, still clutching his smoking revolver. George jumps when he speaks to him and half raises the gun, but doesn't shoot. Waite trips him and pins him to the ground, while another man takes the revolver, which George gives up easily now. On the floor of the draper's shop, the injured Daniel loses consciousness. Within a few minutes of the shooting, 2 local doctors appear on the scene to attend to him. But it's too late. Despite their best efforts, he dies within 15 minutes. After his arrest, George is taken to the local police station and charged with murder. He laughs cheerfully as he says, "I have been watching him for 12 years. He's been hiding, but I caught him at last."
Gosh, it's straight out of Hollywood, really, isn't it? That's a very interesting last line that George uses. I've been watching him for 12 years. He's been hiding, but I caught him at last. So this sounds like some historical grievance between the 2 that's been ongoing. So elements of premeditation, albeit 12 years is a very long time to be premeditated. And I wonder what the feud was about. Jen, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I think one of the things that caught me initially was Daniel growling under his breath as he realizes George is coming close on that corner. And so I pick up the same thing, David, in that there is some incredible tension between these men. And then the 2 that he's with, the 2 coworkers that he's standing with, run away. As if to not get caught in the midst of this potential tension. And then again, when he goes into the confectioner shop, I'm a bit surprised as well that there's no interference, right? It almost seems as if everybody in the environment that we're in is just kind of standing back and saying, oh, this is happening now. So it does feel like it's quite built up. I think before we go any further, David, which one of these men is your ancestor?
Well, my ancestor is George Ewart, the murderer. He is my great-great-grandfather.
What is your initial reaction when you retell this story, when you share this piece of your history? What comes up first for you?
Well, this is a very live piece of history for me. It's something that I've always known about. It's obviously been a story that has not been forgotten in my family. I've stood on the street exactly where this happened with newspaper reports. And it's raw. It's a really terrible thing to have happened. And it's one of those bits of history that I think many families have, where something has happened that's reverberated down through the generations, that shows that, events of a moment, events on a single day can last for centuries, generations.
Yeah, certainly.
And isn't it ironic that this is your great-great-grandfather, and I wonder to what extent you would have known as much about your great-great-grandfather if he hadn't committed this crime. Inevitably, crime involves the state recording information about working class people that they wouldn't necessarily have recorded at all.
Well, in some ways, I think my family history, this is my mother's family, my father's Nigerian, it proves, I think, one of the great truisms of genealogical research, which is that when you are dealing with working class people, people who don't have property, whose records don't appear in wills and in inventories and lots of other documentary places, that your best chance of hearing the voices of your ancestors are if they're involved in the military, if they serve in the army or navy, or even more often, more vividly, if they're involved in the criminal justice system. And as we'll go on to hear, I can hear the voice of my great-grandfather through the reports because of this tragedy. All of my other ancestors go to their grave mute. Their voices are not in the historical record. But George, because of this experience, because of this crime, I can hear his voice. I can, in some ways, build up more of a biography of him than any one of his generation or the earlier generations or even later generations.
I feel very lucky to have both of you here because you can give me more background now in terms of George, but in terms of the biography, where he comes from, what age he was at this point, and then, was he married? Did he have children? What happens to him?
So let's then dive into the characters at play here, because there's certainly a number of people involved. Of course, we want to look at George Ewart, your great-great-grandfather, and Daniel Gray, the victim. But there are a handful of other people. So let's introduce them in a bit of detail. George, our shooter today, is born in 1836 in Scotland, so he's indeed 64 years old at the time of the crime.
But I didn't realise he was Scottish, so welcome to the clan, David. It's nice to have a fellow Scot in the room.
Why aren't you both wearing kilts right now? Yeah.
Well, my family, as the records show, they came from Haddingtonshire, outside of Edinburgh. I've been to the farm that they farmed for generations, the fields near the town of Tranent, south of the battlefield of Prestonpans.
Yeah.
They could not be more Scottish. They were even living in the town of Tranent when the Tranent massacre took place, which was Scotland's version of the Peterloo massacre.
Yeah.
So they are lowland working class agricultural labour Scots. And George is part of that generation who are like millions of families in the 19th century, moves from rural to urban, moves from agricultural labourer to industrial labourer. And the poetry of it is that the river that runs through Haddingtonshire is the Scottish Tyne, and they moved to the English Tyne, from a rural town Tyne to an industrial river Tyne.
But that's quite a big, major change, isn't it, in terms of that person's understanding of themselves and their place in the world, if they're moving from a very rural community to, a built-up urban environment.
This is the son of the son of the son, we think, of agricultural labourers, of ploughmen, people who took horses and ploughs out into the fields outside Edinburgh, and that was the metre and rhythm of life for generations. And George, after 3 generations of working the land, finds himself working in a shipyard in the industrial megacity that was Newcastle upon Tyne, 1880s, 1890s. It is rushing towards a city of 250,000. And he goes from his neighbours being the people in the next farm to living in hyper-urban density. Around the time this crime happens, George Simmel is writing about the metropolis and mental life. There is a recognition, a growing recognition that's going to come that this is an unbelievably complicated transition for people who were born in rural conditions.
So let's talk about George Ewart for just a minute and give a few details of his life. He's born 24th of June, 1836 in Scotland. In 1856, he marries Rachel, who at the time of their marriage is a domestic servant. So both families from working class environment, they get married in Scotland and then eventually make their way down into the Newcastle area. He's a picture frame maker at this point, so his occupation is moving in carpentry. He's definitely going between picture framing and shipbuilding and those types of roles. Together, the two of them have 13 children. 3 girls and 5 boys survive, so they lose 5 children over the course of their marriage. At some point, she is actually pregnant for nearly 20 years.
Gosh.
Yeah, just shy of 20 years. And we know that the environment inside the house was quite tense as well. There is testimony in the case that George was actually quite abusive to Rachel, something that their daughter testified to, that she would sleep in the same bed as her mother to essentially help protect her mother. an abusive environment, overwhelmed probably by society and the Metropolitan District. So in 1881, he's working as a shipbuilder and a joiner. And then a very, very important event happens on the 14th of September, 1886, when he is attacked by our victim, Daniel Gray.
Do we know why he's attacked?
Well, there's some allusion to it. What the newspapers tell us is that Daniel shows up on the doorstep and asks for their eldest son, Richard, or who he refers to as Dick. They are about the same age, so they probably have some kind of a relationship between these two men. George responds that the son is in London. Daniel calls him a liar, and he gets aggressive, and he strikes him in the head. He hits him so hard that he actually loses sight, or at least partially sighted, in his left eye.
Gosh, so here's the beginning of the feud, I'm presuming. And David, what does the family oral history tell us about that feud?
We know nothing more than is in the newspaper reports, but this incident, this very violent attack to strike somebody, some of the accounts talk about a knife, most of them don't. The presumption is that this was a blunt instrument or this was a fist. To be able to blind somebody, to strike them that hard that they lose sight in their eye, means this was an extraordinarily violent incident. And as you say, this is the beginning of a series of events. So it's the catalyst for something that's going to destroy the lives of both men.
How should we characterize your great-great-grandfather? Is he blind, partially sighted, or, is he disabled? Is he unable to work thereafter?
I think he's certainly disabled. The accounts are confused and somewhat contradictory. It's clear that he has some sight, but it's also clear that this attack by Daniel Gray totally destroys his ability to look after his family, that a man who is a skilled joiner, who is able to look after a very large family, to keep them in a reasonably respectable and comfortable, well, not comfortable, but to keep their head above water. To maintain all of that, he has to work, he has to use his skills, and his ability to use his skills is clearly profoundly undermined by this event. I presume, given the age of his children, that he is at least relying partially on income coming into the household by his older children who are working. And his ability, in an age when work and masculinity are deeply interconnected, to care and provide for his family is undermined by this.
Well, you've used the phrase masculinity, and clearly there's a performance of masculinity. And something that resonates with contemporary murder is this sense that often murderers will, people will lash out at the victim who they feel has somehow stolen their sense of self, stolen their status by not giving them the respect that they feel that they're due. They feel they've lost face. What intrigues me about this case is just how long, though, this kind of simmering beneath the surface feud continues for. 12 years?
Well, it's 10 years, and I think the fact that he gets the dates wrong. Daniel Gray attacks my ancestor on the 14th of September, 1886, and George shoots him on the 10th of September, 1896.
So 10 years.
It's 10 years and 4 days. I'm sure he didn't realise that it was almost 10 years to the day.
I wonder to what extent as well the attack that's going to partially blind him is going to affect him in other ways. Is there some kind of brain injury, frontal lobe injury, which is going to affect the way that he might process information?
When I read the newspaper reports from my ancestors, my great-grandparents' generation, George Ewart's children, about their father's behaviour over many years, that is not the behaviour of somebody who is not suffering from some form of mental illness, mental injury.
And I wonder to what extent that George's family talked about him having stable moments when he seemed to be okay, and other times when perhaps he was a bit less rational in terms of his approach to the world.
I mean, looking at the evidence, this 10-year period between 1886 and 1896 is punctuated with calmer periods and more troubled periods. I think this is both in terms of George Ewart's mental health, which seems to rise and fall, and also in his experience of pain. He clearly is having periods when he is in profound pain in his head and his one of the newspaper reports calls his destroyed eye. He was struggling with his eyesight getting worse to operate at all as a joiner. There's testimony in court from people he worked with who said that he could barely put two bits of wood together. This was a man who was beginning to fall back on that phrase that you sometimes see in slave inventories. He was old and useless. Respectability, the cult of respectability in the 19th century is so intimately interconnected with your ability as a man to provide for your family. That was gone and it was getting worse.
Jem, what do we know about the victim, Daniel?
Daniel is, again, kind of an average picture of this very prominent generation that makes this move from rural to metropolitan communities. So he's born in 1854, so about 42 years old at the time of his death when he's shot. So again, about the same age as the eldest son, Dick. He is the son of Daniel and Agnes Gray. He's born in Edinburgh.
Another Scot?
Yeah. Did
Never
I say
argue
it right?
with the Scots.
No Americanisms on that one today. I practiced that one. He, at the age of 17, is working as a painter, and his father is also a master painter. So he's learning his trade from his father and taking on that work. He marries a woman named Margaret. They have at least 4 children together. So from around 1891, he's working in the West End, at least according to his wife at the trial, the area of Newcastle that spans roughly 6 miles along the river. What would this area have been like at the time, the West End of Newcastle?
Well, when we think of West End, we often think of the West End of London.
Yeah.
The West End of Newcastle is about the opposite. It's the Shields Road, which goes to North Shields on the end of the Tyne, where it meets the North Sea. That is an area infamous for having a huge number of pubs. So you have a city with a profound alcohol problem, a city of people working very, very hard in very industrial work, a society saturated with a sense of masculinity and also of alcohol and all the social problems that come with it. And I'm not in the least bit blaming anyone for wanting a relief of a drink at the end of the day from lives immeasurably more difficult than my own. But this is a tough place to be. I went and stood there. I go to Newcastle often. My family is still in the northeast. I left my hotel, walked along the Shields Road. They lived, both Daniel Gray and George Ewart, in this sea of what are called Tyneside flats, houses where there's an upstairs and a downstairs flat. This is Victorian Tyneside's version of high-density living. All of those houses have been swept away by the slum clearances of the 50s and 60s because they were brick favelas.
And what happens to Daniel Gray, though? Because at the end of the day, he's just assaulted somebody. Is Daniel Gray charged? Does he get sent to court? Does he go to prison? What happens, Jen?
You know, this might surprise you, actually, David. He is tried and he is sentenced, but he gets 2 months in jail.
I was looking at sentence guidelines for the present day and looking at recent cases. And cases where people have blinded a victim in a violent attack, people tend to get between 7 and 10 years in prison these days. Which feels more appropriate? Well, if Daniel Gray had got 10 years, he would have been coming out of prison in 1896, rather than having spent 10 years minus 2 months living a quarter of a mile a few streets away from George Ewart. One of the issues that's debated and discussed in this court case is whether or not Daniel Gray was jeering in the streets, mocking George Ewart. And George makes this claim repeatedly that this isn't someone who not only took his sight, led him to a life of pain, and he often, in the reports we hear, that he lives periodically with pain. This is a man who did all of this to him. And he says repeatedly in questioning that Daniel Gray would jeer at him and hiss at him in the street. I think there's 2 events here. There's the attack and then there's the sentence. It's evident that George feels that 2 months for him having been given a life sentence of being partially blinded, a life sentence of no longer ever being able to care for his family financially, that he sees what he has suffered compared to what the law imposes upon Daniel Gray as a complete mismatch. In some ways, he doesn't feel justice has been served.
And what about the public reaction? You know, you've built up a wonderful picture, David, of, you know, this kind of densely populated area. These are characters. There's been a simmering feud for a decade. How did the public react to this shooting? Were they on the side of Daniel, or were they on the side of your great-great-grandfather?
I think one of the most shocking things for me as a historian and as an ancestor is just how big a story this was. I wasn't surprised that this appeared in the Newcastle newspapers. I was surprised that it appears in the national newspapers.
Gosh.
This is a national story. In the big report of the day of the verdict, there is an account of crowds gathering outside the court, people trying to get in, the police having to ask questions of people who are queuing up to see whether they've got enough of a reason to be there. There's even a sort of classic bit of late Victorian misogyny, complaining that too many young women had, of the reputedly gentler sex, had tried to get into the courtroom, having come to see a fellow creature tried for life, suggesting women have no business engaged in this serious legal case. This is an enormous story. Newcastle had a problem with prostitution. It had a problem with a culture of alcoholism. It didn't have that much violent crime. So this is an unusual case. This is a very high-profile murder, but it's also, I think, in its nature, something in which people felt able to take sides.
And what side did they take?
So the newspaper language in this is actually quite stereotypical of the period. It was very common for newspapers in this era to very much take a side, just as it is today. And the language they use is very telling. So they talk about Daniel Gray as a savage, which is obviously quite negative language.
That word really struck me.
Yeah, it really stands out. And then they talk about George as a respectable man, trying to take care of his family, suffering for many years, struggling with this bad eyesight. So it's very clear right from the very first report that the public is very much on the side of George.
It says that one of the reports said that George bore the character of a respectable artisan and a skillful workman. This, again, the cult of respectability, that this is somebody who doesn't look the way criminals are supposed to look. Right. And this is a period, as you will know, where the idea of the criminal class, or sometimes the criminal race, that they have a certain physiological as well as personal characteristics. And, this is the age of physiognomy and phrenology, that George Ewart, my ancestor, doesn't look the way criminals should, and therefore that should be taken into account. It's a very, I think, disturbing form of journalistic titillation.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me, though, specifically the word savage, which has been shown to specifically been used predominantly for those who are of non-Caucasian descent. So people of color are typically referred to in some kind of a savage or similar language. In this case, Daniel Gray he's Scottish, so his ethnicity is not really in question, but they assign him that role in society through the use of that word.
So, Jen, this brings us directly to the trial, I suppose. What happens to George Ewart? What's he charged with? What happens at court? What's the sort of evidence that's presented back and forth? Yeah,
I mean, you can imagine this is, there's several witnesses. This is broad daylight. He is charged with murder, and the trial does continue. It's interesting how much in the trial comes out about the motive of revenge. The idea of this all really feeds back into that very fateful event where he loses his eyesight. In fact, quoted during the trial, saying, "I swore on the day that Gray got 2 months, I would have revenge as he did not get justice."
One of the details that comes out in court that I think is interesting is the weapon that was used. It's a revolver that's called a Bulldog, a mass-produced British revolver. And what's significant about it is the barrel is just 2.5 inches long. And that means it's inaccurate at anything other than close range. It's actually quite an infamous weapon by the time we get to the 1890s because it had been used in the assassination of President Garfield in the United States.
Love a bit of American history,
so
David. Thanks for that.
There.
And of course, because of its inaccuracy, you're up close and personal to the person that you're going to be killing. So, which again brings out this element of revenge that seems to have been at the heart of it.
It does. It explains the sort of geography, the choreography of the murder that George has to walk towards. He's said to be beside the postbox, and then he walks towards George because he knows this gun, with his limited eyesight and the limited accuracy of this gun, he needs to get close. But I think it also, you could say this shows that he's bought the weapon, that the only sort of weapon someone with limited eyesight could use who intends to carry out this murder. But he buys it years earlier. And it sits in a shelf somewhere. We know it's corroded because the police, when they get it, they can't get the cartridges, the unspent cartridges, out of the revolver. So this is something maybe bought in the heat of the moment and then put in a drawer, put in a cupboard, forgotten about. And then somehow, for some reason, some acceleration of his deterioration, his mental health, it's in his pocket in September 1896.
Was there any attempt at court to present this as manslaughter as opposed to murder? Was there any attempt? I mean, we've got the McNaughton rules by this stage, David. Surely there would have been some attempt to say that there is what we would now call diminished responsibility in terms of what your great-great-grandfather does.
Well, the big report in the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle very quickly gets to what it calls the question of insanity, and then writes hundreds of words describing the back and forth in court between the defense and the prosecution, which absolutely rests on the case of insanity. Whether George knew what he was doing was wrong. There's a great deal of testimony from people he's worked with, and also his children, my great-grandparents.
And of course, having a public historian here, it's we should explain what the McNaughton rules are. Of course, another Scot involved, Daniel McNaughton, a Scottish wood turner from Glasgow. But what were the McNaughton rules?
The case is 1843. Daniel McNaughton, who's been a successful businessman, who sells his business, goes on a tour of Europe, and then he turns up in London in 1843 in a disturbed state, having convinced himself that he was being spied upon by the Tories, the Conservative Party. He then shoots in the back the man who he thinks is the Tory Prime Minister, Robert Peel. It's actually a civil servant, one of Peel's secretaries. He then dies. And the case rests upon whether or not somebody who believes he is being persecuted by the Conservative Party was in the right mind, was aware that what he was doing was wrong, or whether his mind was so addled and confused that his actions could be explained away and not justified. His actions could be better understood through mental illness. And the case created the test that today we call diminished responsibility, about whether or not somebody is in possession of their faculties to know that what they're doing is right or wrong, whether it's legal or illegal. McNaughton was found not guilty because he was found to be not of sound mind, as what we today would call diminished responsibility.
Brilliantly explained, if I may say. And of course, it's incredibly liberal. We're talking about 1843 here, and we're coming up with a concept about not guilty through reason of insanity. It doesn't mean to say, of course, that McNaughton wasn't punished, although he was given a form of treatment. He goes to Bethlehem and then would eventually be moved to Broadmoor. But this is an incredible positive development in social history, legal history at the time.
It is surprisingly early, the idea that people who commit even terrible crimes, because they are mentally ill, should be given treatment rather than punishment. The public should be protected from them, but that they should not be treated as other criminals who've carried out acts with malice aforethought. That takes place very early. Even before the McNaughton ruling, we have the Lunatics Act, which I think is 1800. To the horror of Queen Victoria later in the century, who was the victim of a series of assassination attempts, who's not a big fan of the idea that people were let off in her mind because of their mental state. And I think it does show that the 19th century is a progressive century, that the Victorian reformer, this idea that the criminal justice system needs to take into account people's circumstances, not just what they've done on paper, that takes place, I think, earlier than we might imagine.
And this jeering that your great-great-grandfather talks about, that Daniel may or may not have engaged in, is that evidence of George hearing voices and venting the jeering, or do other witnesses talk about the jeering having taken place in the street?
I think that's critical. I'd love to hear what you think about that, Jen.
Yeah, I think it's actually also very important as well. But there is testimony in the case that specifically from Margaret, who was Daniel's wife.
All right.
And she says that it was unlikely he had jeered at George because he had good character and was brought up differently than that. So there's testimony to the opposite effect of this actually taking place. But that social implication, again, speaking to the masculinity of the period and saying he's teasing me in the street publicly. This is again a public assault, not just a physical one, but a social one, a mental one, an emotional one. That would have had a lasting impact, certainly, whether it was conjured in his head or it was real.
And that's really pivotal. One of the defense arguments is that he may have been imagining this jeering by Daniel Gray. That is further proof that he was suffering from mental ill health. The most emotive for me of the evidence of mental ill health comes from George's daughter, Sylvia, who is a teenager. And she goes to court and she has to testify about the erratic and violent behavior of her father in public, in a very, very public, a very, very frightening setting. And she is described as doing so. They said the witness gave her evidence in a quiet, ladylike and pathetic way. And there seemed to be deep sympathy with her within the court. Now, my mother remembered Sylvia. She knew her as an old woman. And I think one of the things for my family, when we first looked at these newspaper reports, is just realizing what those people who my mother knew as when they were old people, what they'd been through. A teenager in court, in some ways pleading for the life of her father, and by doing so, by admitting just how frightened of her father they had become. And her evidence does suggest that this was reaching a catalyst. Things were getting worse and worse. His physical pain, his mental health, he was becoming more erratic, more violent. He was talking to himself. He was laughing about nothing. He was going out of the house and then coming back in the middle of the night. She had to admit to all of this in public as a teenager in the hope it might sway a jury to save her father's life. And that trauma was transmitted down the generations.
That does seem to be evidence of some sort of psychosis, though, doesn't it?
I think her evidence is the strongest, that not only was there a form of psychosis, which may well have been a side effect of the trauma he suffered when he lost his health, but that it was getting worse. It was reaching a crescendo.
So we did actually ask a psychiatrist in the modern sense what those symptoms lead up to. All of those things that were listed out in court during the testimony, especially Sylvia's testimony. And the psychiatrist in today's sense says it's not really a straightforward specific diagnosis, and obviously difficult without access to a patient. But it could be some form of psychotic illness, such as schizophrenia or being bipolar. It could have been early onset dementia. Some of those factors play in particularly strongly in that, especially if it's worsened quickly in the last several months, for example, or a serious head injury, which can cause a range of symptoms, which of course we know he has endured and suffered.
And Jen, did the court in Newcastle take into account George Ewart's circumstances?
Two doctors give medical evidence. The first is Dr. Calcutt, medical superintendent at the Gosforth Asylum with 20 years experience. He interviews George 3 times, but 6 to 8 weeks after the crime. So he's very clear in his testimony that he can't really speak to his state of mind in the moment of the murder. But he does claim during those interviews, George claims that he did not mean to kill Daniel, that he wanted to wound him only in a life-altering way, that his poor eyesight and Daniel's sudden movement meant that he missed his original target, which was his arm, and ended up shooting him in the ribs. He said he didn't actually know he'd shot him, and actually states, and another quote, if I may, from the papers, "If I had known I had hit him, I would not have been here now because I intended to take my own life."
There was another part, Jen, of Calcutt's testimony that I found really interesting. When he interviews George, he says this: "I did not consider I was doing wrong, for does not the Bible say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth?" And then he goes on to explain, I think in really tragic terms, how he saw this. He said, "I had always had a good home for my family and brought them up respectably before I was injured. And since then, I have been dependent upon them and my life has been misery. I think that speaks to that total loss of purpose, that loss of masculinity, that loss of the ability to provide for your family. This is a man who has been father to 13 children, has 8 living children, and he's now dependent upon them because of an incident 10 years earlier. That loss of sense of self and identity, as well as the pain, as well as the mental disturbances that come with it, as well as the being partially blinded, I think there he does speak to what the past 10 years had been like for him. When I first got these newspaper reports, as well as obviously my great-grandfather's name, the name that stood out was that of Dr. Hardcastle. That's Dr. Nicholas Hardcastle. He was the surgeon at Newcastle Prison in the 1890s, and he is the last person called to give evidence about the mental state of my ancestor. He absolutely dismisses the idea that George Ewart is suffering from any sort of mental ill health. Hardcastle was a huge figure in Newcastle. He'd been a figure in the city since the 1850s. The fact that they don't even give his name, they just say Hardcastle. They don't say Nicholas Hardcastle. It's because everyone knew who he was. The reason this was shocking for me is not just because he's so dismissive of all the evidence given by Sylvia and others. It's that I've stood in his house, because Nicholas Hardcastle lived in a house in Ravensworth Terrace in Newcastle, which was the subject of a television series I make for the BBC called House Through Time.
Of course.
And I have spent weeks in the house in which Nicholas Hardcastle lived back in the 1850s, when he was involved in a very unpleasant incident of neglect of people in the workhouse when he was the surgeon in the workhouse. And read his letters, read reports about him, and had, in a way that's not very professional for an historian, a strong dislike of this figure who had lived decades before I was born. I'm allowed to dislike historical figures when I'm making a TV program. It's not very professional, but I can sort of get away with it and mumble it in the lunchtime and complain. And when I read these newspaper reports and realised that I'd stood in the house of the man who went to court in Newcastle and was the sort of final blow that led to the sentencing of my great-great-grandfather, it felt very uncomfortable.
But it's not that unusual to have psychiatrists disagree with each other. And Hardcastle, I can see from the note there, is described as the surgeon. Yeah. So I wonder to what extent he had been trained in psychiatry.
He has no training in psychiatry, but he is almost a celebrity in Newcastle by the 1890s. He's someone who's, of course, going to be called into this case, and he's at Newcastle Prison. So he's had access to George Ewart, but he doesn't have the professional knowledge to make the statements I think he makes in court. Again, this is with me admitting a very unprofessional personal dislike of this historic figure.
Well, that sounds pretty compelling to me. Please don't tell me he's going to be found guilty of murder and hanged.
So if you were a jury sitting on this case, what would your verdict be? David, I'd like to start with you.
I think the very hard thing for a jury is that although there is very strong evidence that my ancestor George was suffering from mental ill health, the difficulty is what George himself says. What he says in questioning to the medical, to the doctors who attend to him. He quotes scripture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the things he says when he's arrested. When he hears that Daniel Gray has died, he is gleeful about it. In some ways, he condemns himself because of the things that he says under questioning. And the huge, I think, powerful and emotional weight of evidence that comes particularly from his daughter Sylvia about just how bad his life has been, how poor his mental health was, I think that struggles to weigh against what he has said.
So your verdict?
I suspect if I had been in the jury, I would have said guilty.
David?
I think I would have been persuaded by the evidence that was presented in relation to your ancestor talking about her father and Sylvia. Yeah. I'd have been persuaded much more by that. Even trying to think, I know this is a bit ahistorical, but if I was to put myself in the position of being on the jury at the time, the McNaughton rules had been well established. There was a sense in which, is what he's doing at that moment in time, is he conscious of that being against the law? Is he conscious of that being something that's wrong? I think I'd have been more persuaded by that, actually. I take on board what David has said about Hardcastle and the fact that Hardcastle is a celebrity almost in terms of his expert evidence. And obviously Hardcastle took against your ancestor, but I'm not so sure I'd have been swayed by that. So I probably would have found him not guilty by reason of insanity, is actually what I'd have come to.
I think I agree with both of you in certain regards, but certainly Sylvia's testimony would have been the most prominent, probably, message for me, I think, out of this whole trial. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I can't imagine putting her in that position and having to testify in that kind of situation where you know your father is abusive and your family life has been so fractured and so torn apart by these events, but also just his behavior and his decline. I think I'm going to have to go not guilty by reason of insanity.
But do you think there's a risk that we're doing this 21st century?
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely.
Because I think a jury of Victorians looking at these statements that George made with an eloquent prosecution barrister reminding them of these very frightening statements, admission, even appearing pleased when the news that Daniel had died. I think that would have been hammered home in the summary at the end, and that those words would have been ringing in the ears when the jury retired.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a perspective of modern day viewpoint, and I don't know that it's really feasible for us as observers of this case and for listeners of the podcast to truly separate themselves in that way. You're always going to see it with that kind of lens of perception.
Well, I like the idea that there's a modern viewpoint about these issues, because increasingly I wonder to what extent we're still dealing with the same issues today as we were back in the 1890s.
David, could you tell us, what is the final verdict in this case?
Well, the judge in his summing up says something which I think is very critical, and he refers, not in name, but he refers to the McNaughton rules.
Okay.
He says, the question was now and had for many years been settled as to what the test was, what the test for sanity was. And he goes on to suggest that George Ewart's testimony, what's been heard in court, doesn't meet that test, and that he is of sound mind. He then instructs the jury to retire, and the jury come back an hour later, and this is what the foreman says: "We find him guilty, but with a strong recommendation to mercy because of the provocation he received." Now I read that the jury feel bound to come to the decision that they've reached, but that they feel that justice was not served 10 years earlier. Yeah. The provocation of having been partially blinded, having been sent into this spiral of pain and mental ill health by this incident 10 years earlier, that needed somehow to be taken into account despite the weight of evidence, despite the admission, despite all of the statements George had made under questioning, and that they were hopeful that something would happen and that my ancestor would not be sent to the gallows. But I have to say, it's really horrible to read the judge's summing up after that sentence is passed. And those awful words that were the theatre of British courts applied to my ancestor it's horrific.
Was mercy shown, or did he go to the gallows?
So there is a petition that started, we believe by George's legal defense, garners eventually around 18,000 signatures, which is a fairly substantial petition.
Well, Newcastle is a city of around 200,000, so that's almost 10% of the population.
So because of the number of signers on the petition, we cannot assume that they are all simply working class George and Daniel's neighbors. We know from evidence across the newspapers that he was supported by a broad range of men across the community. So we have quotes in the paper that tell us that clerical individuals, medical, legal professionals signed the petition. City council members signed the petition, merchants, leading tradesmen of the city. In fact, one of the most notable names that I came across, it's reported on the 28th of November in 1896 that one of the men who is a prosecutor at the trial, Mr. Hans Hamilton, signs the petition.
That's really unusual, isn't it? That kind of suggests something. It's also kind of romantically positive, isn't it? That people still believe that getting a petition up is a way of influencing public policy, or in this case, a judicial decision.
So the petition proves very popular. It spreads across the community. In fact, they actually host open-air meetings at local businesses, garnering support from people walking the sidewalks, walking passerbys, just simply using those businesses in that community and in that area, all signing this petition.
And it reflects just how big a court case this has been. This has been every day. There's every day in the newspapers. This is a tragedy and a murder that catches the imagination of a huge number of people. As you've said, they're not the normal demographic of people committing violent crime. A man, the victim is in 40s, the perpetrator in his 60s. There is this terrible attack that had taken place 10 years earlier. And I think there is something very deep in all of us about the sanctity of sight. To have had your sight taken is such a theft, such a loss, that I think that does garner sympathy in a way that few things do.
So there's actually a very kind of lucky event. The day before he is scheduled to go to the gallows to be executed, there's actually a stay of execution because the executioner was busy somewhere else. He was out of town. So likely his supporters, we've talked about the petition, they took this moment as an opportunity to really push that petition through. And it is indeed successful. So on the 4th of September, 1896, the death sentence is overturned.
And what happens then? Where does he go? Does he serve a sentence? Does he go to Broadmoor? What happens?
He's sentenced instead and committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum.
So this is the first secure hospital, as we'd now call them, in England. Opens in 1863 in Berkshire. Again, partly back to this idea that actually the Victorians were thinking through in a very kind of liberal way about how to manage people. You know, the surprising thing, I think, even to modern audiences, is just how people can recover in places such as a secure hospital that's got staff who are trained to cope with people who've got mental health problems, and how those mental health problems can be alleviated, controlled by drugs and so forth.
Right, remember Broadmoor took criminals, but it also took just mental health patients. So there was a mix of patients there. By the end of the century, there are significantly more males than females. There's 481 males to 187 females. People are starting to outlive their sentencing and outliving the discharge numbers. So the facility is becoming crowded.
Does he die in Broadmoor? Does he survive? Does he go on and come back out of hospital?
We don't know exactly how or when or why. We know in 1901 he is at Broadmoor. He's in the census, enumerated at the facility. His wife Rachel is living alone by herself in 2 rooms in Newcastle. But in 1911, George is now found in the 1911 census living with his daughter Sylvia and her family. She's married, she has children, and she is now has her father in her home again.
And this is back in Newcastle?
Back in Newcastle.
Yeah,
so the daughter who had given testimony to save her father's life has her father home many years later. That what happened at Broadmoor, we'll never know. That if there was treatment, if he just recovered, if he just needed to be taken out of that terrible position, but he does recover. And in the end, I do feel that he did something absolutely terrible, but he was, I think, demonstrably mentally ill. And I think it shouldn't have taken a reprieve and an accident. I think he should have been found guilty of manslaughter. I think he was certainly guilty, but not murder. And I think you can see that from the testimony of the jury through the foreman. I think you can see that in the newspaper reports. I think you can see it in the petition, that many people in Newcastle felt that a man who had been plunged into a life of literal darkness and mental darkness by by another man, that was, as the foreman said, a terrible provocation, and that he had acted not in his right mind. We mustn't forget that Daniel Gray is murdered. And I'm very aware that this story, this terrible event, one morning in 1896, reverberated through my family. But there's another family, the Gray family. Maybe they're still in Newcastle.
We did do a little bit of digging on the Gray family to try and answer that question as well. After the death of her husband, Margaret, who of course is now a widow, she has 4 children at home, she remarries. So in 1901, the family is still in Byker, and includes, of course, her second husband, Edward, and their brand new 5-month-old baby. By the 1911 census, Margaret and Edward had 3 more children. So she actually indicates on the census that she's had 11 children in total, 6 of which survived to the 1911 census.
And then what happens to that family thereafter? Have we been able to
remain in Newcastle, and their children grow? And
our 2 families have this shared tragedy.
Mm.
And is that how you think we should think about what's gone on here? It's a tragedy for both families, the Greys, the Ewarts, and your ancestors.
Absolutely, and this begins in September 1886, not 96. That attack, that moment of violence, whatever motivated it, that puts both families on a trajectory towards tragedy. And it was probably something petty. It was probably something small, a result of poverty, of people living too close to each other, of people not being educated enough, not being emotionally literate. I'm really struck by the newspaper reports. They call it the tragedy at Byker. And I think there is that sense that a man who had been half blinded or mainly blinded, who'd been eaten alive by this grievance for a decade, and this man who had committed this violent crime 10 years earlier, that all of them were in their different ways victims. I don't think this is a simple case of wrong and right. I think it is a case of tragedy. And this story, this event in the 1890s, this reverberated through my family.
In what way, David? That's a very broad and powerful statement, but in what way has it shaped your family's history, do you think?
Because it shaped attitudes that were passed on between generations, ideas about control, very Victorian and Edwardian ideas about that idea that actions or predilections could be passed down between generations, and a sense among some generations in my family that they had to control themselves because something terrible had been done by a member of our family with whom we shared kinship. This idea almost of bad blood. It shaped my grandfather's life. My grandfather was told by his mother that her father had been a murderer. He was told he must never lose control. My grandfather never drank. He signed the temperance pledge as a teenager. He never went into a pub. He never ever tasted alcohol. Instead, he used to go to the Literary and Philosophical Society and read the newspapers. He had a collection of everyman books. He learned to play the violin. And that environment of self-improvement, of education, shaped my mother's generation. My mother went to a very fine grammar school, and my mother was at the centre of educating her children.
Including you, David.
Including me. But 3 of my mother's children teach at British universities.
Yeah.
That tragedy, in a very strange and very uncomfortable way, set our family off in a different direction. That sense that there was something terrible that almost lived in the blood and needed to be pushed away through behaviour and self-control and self-education. I think that shaped every generation that's followed.
David, thank you so much for bringing this story to us and bringing it to life with such eloquence, actually, and contextualizing it from a very kind of a kind of rivalry within Newcastle and broadening it out to include an urbanization, industrialization, masculinity, and Scotland.
And Scotland, yeah.
It's quite a legacy that this case leaves behind, isn't it, I think? There's so many stories to tell from this. But again, my thanks for your contribution today and bringing us this story to kick off our series. We are delighted to have you with us, and thank you for being a guest, our first guest on Was Justice Served?
Thank you very much.
All of the stories featured in Was Justice Served have been uncovered using Findmypast historical newspapers and family history records. Discover thousands of untold stories hidden within British and Irish newspaper pages, delve into the rich details of your family history, and clip and save your articles in your very own collections on Findmypast.
And in the next episode, we'll be delving into a mysterious double poisoning case from 1887.